I mean, what does that teach us in terms of that question? Now.
You want to? No. Yeah, Katrina, start.
On the WikiLeaks, I just want to say, you know, I follow Russia carefully, and the image of Russia is often about journalists being killed or harassed. But there is a blogger in Russia today called Alexei Navalny, who's like the Glenn Greenwald of Russia, who has set up a WikiLeaks site called Rospil. And he posts corporate documents, and he asks Russian citizens to bring their information to bear, to add information from their local communities, the corruption they witness in their communities. I think we could set up a very powerful wiki tool on corporate power, and there could be whistleblowers, there could be citizens, it could mass corporate information and community information around this country that would be very effective. If Russia can do it, America can do it.
Just one little footnote.
And we should stop torturing the young military person who was involved in leaking the information.
This one was actually directed to you, Jay, so now you're really on the spot.
Okay.
Please give some examples of exactly how you can, quote, point people to the root cause, RE, the Wisconsin situation, General Electric, et cetera.
Well, I think with you know, any of the elected politicians and any of the issue fights that we're in, there is, to a certain degree, a paper trail about where the money has come from. And we do have, in the public interest sector, quite a few organizations dedicated to research on this issue. I mean, the OpenSecrets.org, which I quoted, Maplight.org, if you don't know that, MAPLIGHT, Sunlight Foundation, the folks at Public Campaign have got good information online, so that there really are available for virtually any journalist or interested citizen a lot of data resources. Now, I think that as part of this We the People project, there are more data sets that are effectively kind of, they're great data, but they're kind of locked away in individual organizations. And I think one of the objectives of our group is going to be to try to pull them together in some databases where more people and more journalists could have access to them. So there's work to be done in that area, but we have, at least at a base level, a pretty good start.
A question that goes to Bonifaz. Should the 28th Amendment also deny corporations the right to donate money to elections? That's the question, but I'll modify it by saying, in addition to that, you know, there's always this question, there's really two constitutional amendments that one could argue for, right? One would reverse the effects of the 76 Supreme Court Buckley-Valeo, which says money equals speech, and the other relates to the corporation's First Amendment rights. Can you sort of explain both and how they fit together?
Yes, so actually, just to be clear though from the question, corporations are still, as of today, prevented from giving directly to candidates. The 1907 Tillman Act states that. Is that going to be challenged? Probably so, in light of the Citizens United ruling. So it is not the case that corporations can today give directly to candidates, but they can, as a result of the Citizens United ruling, spend independently up to the sky out of their general treasury funds. That's what's different. As far as the amendment question, you know, I think that we certainly can discuss all the kinds of amendments that are needed, not solely the one around corporations not being treated as people. And one of the ones that Josh references is one that ought to be part of the national discussion, which is, does money equal speech? The United States Supreme Court said in 1976, in a case of Buckley v. Valeo, effectively that, and struck down congressional campaign spending limits passed in the wake of the Watergate scandal. So our current system of unlimited campaign spending is a result of that ruling. And as somebody who's worked with many others in the courts to try to get that ruling revisited, ultimately getting to the Supreme Court in 2006, and ultimately the Supreme Court reaffirming that ruling, I think it's pretty clear that an amendment to really overhaul that doctrine would be in order. There's also been the push since Bush v. Gore to make clear in the Constitution that we have an affirmative right to vote. We are one of only 10 nations out of 110 plus democracies around the world that does not have affirmative language in our U.S. Constitution guaranteeing the right to vote. That's why Justice Scalia said in that ruling Bush v. Gore, there is no individual right to vote for the electors for President of the United States. So, you know, there's an argument to be made that we need a series of democracy amendments. The Equal Rights Amendment for Women is an Equal Rights Amendment, in fact, is a model that we should continue to engage in with respect to this amendment campaign, because the ERA, while have yet to be enacted, was a very valuable campaign in terms of changing the national debate and the conversation and getting people to recognize gender equality being on the table. It still needs to be enacted, I fully agree, but I think it shows the value of a constitutional amendment campaign, even if it doesn't get enacted right away. So we need a series of amendments to expand democracy. I'll just come back on the corporations and First Amendment. I think the question here needs to be really whether corporations have any constitutional rights under the Constitution, not only under the First Amendment. It is true that the vast majority of jurisprudence on this question is around the First Amendment. Corporate speech is the idea that's been pushed over the past 30 years. But we need to make clear that, you know, corporations do not have rights like you and I under the Constitution, and that's what the amendment that we're pushing for would say.
Thanks. The question is how to frame this issue to resonate truly across the political spectrum. It's easy to say, oh, this is a left-right issue, we need to engage the left and the right, but how do you do it without avoiding the pitfalls of being sort of relegated to the left?
Can I just quickly, you know, one of the things we're doing and plan to do more of is reach out to a transpartisan coalition that can be built in the states on this question. Libertarians, conservatives, Republicans. I cited the polling that we've done that shows the kind of support there is for an amendment. But it is critical in that outreach that we not see this as solely a progressive issue. This is not just a progressive issue. It is not a conservative issue. This is a core American issue. This is a question of what are we as a nation? Is it we the people, or is it we the corporations? And that core question being brought to people in the way that makes it clear. We're not talking about creating a vehicle here that can promote other parts of the progressive agenda. As much as I, as a progressive, support that kind of agenda, if we start adding on all those other kinds of agenda items, then I think we lose that opportunity to build that transpartisan coalition. But we can find common ground and a common vision on this basic question of what are we as a nation? Is it we the people or we the corporations? And that's, I think, needs to be the way we focus the attention. Thanks. Bob is going to weigh in on this, but before you do, and so is Katrina, but before you do, I want to make it a little bit more complex. It's easier to message around the problem of corporate control than it is to message around the other equally crucial fact, which is that the consolidation of wealth is happening at a remarkable and an unsustainable level, and the interests of the very richest 0.1% are vastly disproportionately represented in the halls of power. How do you address this messaging question, understanding that, and that it is both about corporations and it's also about the very rich?
To answer that half, read the book Aftershock by Robert Reich that came out in September of last year. There's some helpful illustrations in there. He points out that before the crash of 1929, salaries of the lowest workers and salaries of management started to spread apart, about that far apart. He looked at, again, right before the 2008 tsunami, and salaries were enormously apart, several hundred times the average worker. And that's why Common Cause has become uncommon and focused on economic disparity as one of the issues that we have to face. Back on the original question, I have two quick suggestions. One is, those of you who care about media should help retrain me, because I, like many of you, use terms like progressive and liberal versus conservatives and independents, and we use the political terminology all the time. Yet I think most people aren't Democrats or Republicans first. They're teachers, they're business leaders, they're small business leaders, they're environmentalists, they're labor folk, and they're Americans. And I think we've got to, I'll talk about myself, I've got to change the way I think, and it's hard because I'm old and it rolls off my tongue. But I think it's important for us to figure out a way because, you know, Warren Buffett is a capitalist and Bill Gates is a capitalist, and there are some things that they do, and there are some socially responsible corporations and people who need to join the fights that we're about. So we've got to learn how to talk about it. One final thing, for those of you organizing around some of these issues, I think we need some models of elected officials who, when I served in Congress, worked very closely together. The Schweikers and Hines and Jake Javits and Senator Brooks and Senator Percy and a whole host of House members were my best friends. And I was always fighting pork barrel, bull weevil Democrats of the South and the West, particularly on environment and water projects. I think we ought to go back and take a look at who's still living in that crowd and have some strange bedfellows who come out of the Republican moderate community and the former Democratic elected officials in the House and Senate, and get them out of the closet, get them out of their houses, and get them out speaking truth to power so that we can model for young people. Young people have only seen a conservative Republican Party that's to the right of Jesse Helms in their ideology. And there was a time when, after election, Democrats and Republicans put in place the Older Americans Act, Head Start, the first energy bill, resource recovery legislation, the community right to know provisions were not put in place by Democrats. It was a collaboration. We got to restore that. I don't think you restore it with the current crowd in Washington because of the partisanship.
Just very briefly, picking up on what Bob said, I do think there are models of elected officials across parties working together in Washington. They're not best friends by any means, but they are kind of unlikely bedfellows. And on issues we care about and should care about if we want to find a people's budget, so to speak, an economy, Barney Frank and Ron Paul had a plan to cut $1 trillion from the defense budget over 10 years, and the Fair Elections Now Act, bipartisan. You had Durbin, John Larson, and then I'm forgetting who the Republican co-sponsors were. Walter Jones, who is an interesting figure. I do think issues of community and localism play a role in uniting people around this issue in a transpartisan way, and we should think harder how to do that. A sense that communities are feeling, you know, small business owners, for example, feeling displaced by big corporate power. And to complicate the issue, you know, millions of Americans do work in corporations. So how do you reach out to them and speak to them about an alternative? And this is where I pick up on what Bob said. I think there's a lot of interesting work being done by not just socially responsible, but even deeper thinking about how to, quote, tame this behemoth corporate economy. Jamie Raskin, I think one of the most brilliant state senators, has something called a B Corporation, which is about rechartering the corporation. This is reformist, but it's not to the root, but it's rechartering the corporation so that it's no longer the bottom line profit maximization as its main duty, but sustainability, environmental sustainability, community commitment, workers' rights. I think move your money campaigns at scale are very important. Finding ways to speak to your pension funds and moving those at scale so they're not being used for dirty energy and other things. State banks have acquired a new momentum, and I think that's encouraging. And community credit unions, just back to that sense of community, because I think that has transpartisan value.
Okay. One thing. John mentioned that large majorities of self-identified conservatives oppose the idea of having corporations muck around in politics. I probably paraphrased it a little bit off, but anyway, you get the idea. And I think it's important to realize that, you know, reasonable people across the spectrum can be opposed to having corporations active in politics without being anti-business. And I think that goes to your point, Katrina. There are, you know, again, of the media makers out there, you know, talk to the local business people about about the proper role of business in the political sphere. And I think you'll find that a lot of small business people feel completely shut out of this system. And you look at the stats, and that's where the job creation is coming from in large number.
Yeah, I want to say amen to that, and also say that the 2008 economic tsunami had one silver lining. It's the first time in my lifetime that you could critique capitalism. Prior to that, you were always labeled a communist or a socialist. But I think people are beginning to realize that we can keep the idea of capitalism, but not have it based on a percentage of our people being unemployed and a percentage of the world's population being enslaved and a percentage of our people being underpaid. Think of every worker at McDonald's behind the counter. When you're buying a $1 hamburger, if you paid $1.10 or $1.15 for the hamburger, they could have health care and a pension. They could have a living wage. The question is, why have we created an economic system where excess profits exist, but also an economic system that doesn't give someone who works 48 or 50 weeks a year at full time a salary that's below the poverty level? And I think it's time for all of us to look at that as a root cause for our economic disparity.
Thanks, Bob. You know, as I look at all these different cards in front of me, there seems to be a emotional connection to most of them, and that is a deep and I think correct assessment that we have a big mountain to climb. There's a lot of questions here about sort of how the hell are we going to do this? This is, and how could we possibly pass the constitutional amendment? And I think it warrants kind of reiterating the fox putting a lock on the hen house dynamic is never more acute than on this issue, right? This is the issue that is about changing the very political system that got these people into power, and it is those people that sadly, other than the courts, which are very hard to change as well, they're the ones that have to fix it. So I just want to name a personal anecdote for me, which is I must confess that while I think I've got some good ideas about what needs to happen, there is an element in getting involved in this issue, which is kind of like, I'm just going to get in the foxhole and I'm going to get to work and start fighting. And can you all maybe talk about that in some way?
Yeah, I'd like to address that because I think it's a fair point, but I also think we have to go back to our history here. Women did not get the right to vote because men in power thought it was a good idea. They organized, and that's right. And I think there's many other examples of that. The labor struggles of the 30s, obviously the civil rights movement. I mean, the fact is that we have in our history clear examples where people have organized and struggled and died for these basic principles. Congresswoman Donna Edwards wrote, she's a sponsor of a constitutional amendment bill in Congress that we helped to draft, and she wrote in the Boston Review back in October, "We must not be afraid to take bold action. Those who came before us were not afraid. Without their courage, we would not have enacted constitutional amendments that have expanded and protected our democracy, from abolishing slavery and guaranteeing African Americans and women the right to vote to removing the poll tax barrier. The framers placed the amendment process in the Constitution in order to ensure that a government of, by, and for the people would be preserved. We must use that process again in order to safeguard our democracy." I recognize there's an urgency to this question. There clearly is. And I certainly understand the need to push for short-term fixes and disclosure and these other kinds of remedies that have been advanced since the Citizens United ruling in the context of the campaign finance piece are critical. But I also think we've got to maintain the focus on the prize, right? We've got to keep our eyes on the prize. We've got to have that long-term vision and recognize that people who've come before us have fought these kinds of fights as well. They've gone up very, very high mountains, and we've got to do that again.
John, you rightfully quoted from Donna Edwards' great speech, just a footnote, she stepped off of Common Cause's board to run for Congress, so I'm very proud to have been with her at Common Cause. I mentioned earlier that I met Dr. Martin Luther King, and I think you make an important point that you've got to have the long-term vision. I'm a futurist. I want to look out beyond the future. When I was born, there were 2 billion people on planet Earth. There are now 7 billion people on planet Earth. More than half of all the people who ever lived on planet Earth are alive today. Dr. King said something that has to be added to having one eye on the future and one eye on the urgency of now. In a book called Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, he said, we're now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us bare, naked, and dejected with lost opportunity. The tide in the affairs of humanity does not remain at the flood, it ebbs. We may cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage, but time is deaf to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. He closed that comment by saying, we still have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. This may well be humankind's last chance to choose between chaos and community. So I want the longer view, but to recognize we've got to choose community over chaos.
Wow. I will admit it's hard to get out of bed some mornings. These are times which tax good people's souls. But I work with grounded realism and determined idealism, and when people, as editor of The Nation, there's a balance between the ongoing critique, but more and more I feel a need for us to do the reporting, but also offer people pathways to action. And to understand, and this is part of the We the People project, that there's so many good people, groups, organizations, ideas out there, but if we can find a way that different people and different movements are doing their thing, we can move in a coordinated whole and be greater than the sum of our parts. And to speak to movements, how do we make this democracy movement a movement? We have a democracy deficit in this country. I am tired of hearing about the deficit crisis and this crisis. We have a democracy deficit crisis. And we need to make this a movement because you know this history, but just, you know, the great changes of our country have come about from movements. Movements from below with allies on high. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement. You had FDR in the White House around the labor rights movement, but we need to rebuild that movement sense, as Bob, I think, said so well. Not just organizations, not the litany of policy proposals, but a sense of a moral, in a secular sense, a moral imperative that we need to move forward and find a way to rebuild this great nation that we love and convey that in important ways.
I mean, just one personal note, and when I stepped away from Mother Jones a little over a year ago now, part of that was, you know, as much as proud as I have been about the reporting that Mother Jones has done and continues to do, as important as I feel like it is for the general media sphere and our ability to stay informed about these issues, to have strong independent voices like that. What I felt from a personal standpoint was that that Mother Jones was doing a fantastic job at chronicling the decline of our democracy and civilization. And this was in a sense a personal choice to try to get at some of the root causes of that. So I think if you start to assess the resources that we have, however you want to describe it, on the progressive side of things, in terms of, we have labor and fantastic netroots activism and these fantastic research organizations based in Washington, and a core of progressive electeds in Congress, and grassroots organizing and all manner of issues. That the progressive media across many platforms and including new media, that collectively we have a lot of power, but we need to get it organized and coordinated. And I think that's just, it's worth, all of us paying some attention about how to do that and how to build all of these resources into a movement. And I would close just with saying something that I hope isn't just so obvious that it sounds trivial. But at the end of the day, corporations, the well-to-do, can spend unlimited sums of money, according to the Supreme Court, but they can only vote once per person. So the people have the votes. And we can have some short-term victories even as we're working on the long-term systemic problems.
And I'm going to, cheers. I'm also going to do one thing. We're not going to wrap yet, but I'm going to do the unprecedented thing. I'm actually going to wrap this panel just a few minutes early, just so you guys are talked at a lot all day, and there's still a lot more programming to go. Before people do start to trickle out, I do want to mention Combating the Koch brothers is a panel that's going to be happening in Waterfront Room 3 in the next session. And if you're really particularly grabbed by this issue, and I guess you wouldn't stream out if you did that, if you were, but it's going to get into sort of a more granular look at exactly how corporations manipulate policymaking in the most nefarious ways. And I was asked to just mention to you that that's the next kind of follow-on to this one.
Are you suggesting that this was the Diet Coke version?
This is the big picture. This is the big picture one, Bob. This is so. And I'm just gonna answer my own question though, just to add to this last round of answers and say that I believe that what needs to happen is we also need to be willing to move with these policy initiatives that are being promoted, fair elections, constitutional amendment, but that we need to, for the time being, simultaneously, not at the exclusion of, but simultaneously, emphasize things like political accountability. I think we need to, and we will, go into selected districts of the worst behaving politicians in this country and unseat them from power on this issue. That needs to happen. We need to become more aggressive in exposing the really insidious quid pro quo legally, but really in the most kind of, hard-hitting way possible. In-your-face exposure of what has become the legalized bribery in Washington, and bring it to an entirely new level. But because this is a media conference, I'm going to ask a question that kind of pivots a little bit, but it's a really good question, and that is, how can, given the failure of commercial media on so many issues, including this one, and importantly, the conflation of reporting and commentary, which is becoming more and more prevalent as real journalism is expensive and gets cut from the kind of programming we're seeing in commercial media. You don't know if you're getting a commentary or news. And it really is where a big dividing line is, as we see with the left and the right and who they're choosing to watch in terms of where they get their news. How has this affected the people's trust in media, which is at all-time lows right now, and the ability to expose the power of this dynamic and expose the problem of corporate corruption, particularly given the fact that the vast majority of Americans get their news and information from commercial media? Who wants that?
I mean, I don't buy into this, the danger of conflation and of opinion and reporting. I do buy into the problem that we need funding for good investigative reporting, deep reporting. What we need to do is be honest about where we stand from. We do that at the Nation, but I think you want to draw again on what Jay spoke about, and you draw on these great resources out there. I mean, Public Citizen, all of this data, and fact check it to, as hard as you can. But the accountability, we should have an accountability project in the media, not just going into districts, but there should be a fact checking in real time, which we can use new technologies to do. I do believe, we were talking, and I'll stop, about the Koch brothers. I do believe that there is a value, and this runs counter to so much of the kind of structural analysis reporting that so many think needs to be done, but we need to put a human face on this corruption, and that's why the Koch brothers is important. This sounds heretical, but I do think we could use a very good value tabloid journalism to bring to bear, I'm serious, on like the lifestyles of the Koch brothers. Let us report on the armada of lobbyists and lawyers who have helped GE evade taxes. Let us put a human face, because it takes shame and scandal to bring an attention to bear. We see that with the right, with tabloid TV, and why shouldn't the transpartisan pro-democracy community use this form, which is back to the old-fashioned muckrakers of a different generation, to bring attention to the depredations and rapaciousness of corporate power?
I think we all ought to try to be owls, because they're some of the few birds that can see in the dark. In a dark time, the eye begins to see, and I think what we've got to do is shine light on these issues, as Katrina said. So subscribe to The Nation magazine and learn stuff.
This is, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to sort of close this on any sort of rousing note, but I'll tell you what's on my mind. There is, I think that a lot of, well-informed, well-thinking, progressive thinking folks need to disabuse themselves of the notion that corporate media is going to be the solution to our problems. It is not adequate. We will not report certain stories. The Daily Show, Colbert, fantastic. MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, fantastic. They work hard. They're smart. They do great stuff. If that's the entirety of what we got, we're screwed. We can't do it. All right. So I think there needs to be some concentrated effort to think of how do you build up a much more robust independent media system. It doesn't have to necessarily mirror what's out there in the world these days. I mean, certainly we've got transmission lines through certainly not traditional media channels like Move On and Credo and others who are great at sort of passing along certain kinds of stories. But think about the resource that we have in free speech television that's streaming this conference. I mean, it's a fantastic channel, chronically underfunded, right? But if they had more resources for more cameras, more places, more reporting, whatever, that's a resource that collectively we share. And it's not going to be done through traditional channels. It has to be done through our own kind of funding. Another thought, and that is, there was a huge amount of money put into basically corporate media during the Wisconsin fight. What if 10% of that money had gone into independent media, right? From the unions, right? I mean, it's that we have within the resources we're currently spending the ability to significantly leverage what we have as resources. So, just be thinking in creative ways like that about how we can support the media that, in fact, will bring us the stories straight.
And I fully agree with